A woman kneels in the forum, hands bound behind her back, eyes fixed on the cobblestones beneath her. The crowd pressed close, close enough to smell the fear, close enough to see her breath quicken as the auctioneer's hand gripped her jaw, turning her face left, then right, displaying her like pottery. The sun beat down mercilessly. She did not cry. Perhaps she had run out of tears during the march from Gaul. Perhaps she understood that tears would change nothing. The bidding began, and with each raised hand, each shouted number, another piece of her former self-daughter, sister, woman who once chose her own path, dissolved into the Roman air. What happened to captured women after Rome's legions claimed victory was not a footnote to war. It was policy, calculated, documented, and woven so deeply into the machinery of empire that it appeared in tax records, in military manuals, in letters soldiers sent home describing their spoils with the same casual tone they used to discuss the weather. This is the story of how conquest became commerce, how victory became violation, and how an entire civilization built its glory on a foundation most history books prefer to skim past in a single sanitized sentence. Before we go further, I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It never stops amazing me that a story buried under 2,000 years of deliberate silence can suddenly matter again to people across every continent. The year is 106 A.D. Emperor Trajan has just crushed Dacia after 2 brutal campaigns. Official Roman records, preserved in archives and rediscovered centuries later in fragments scattered across Europe, document the outcome with bureaucratic precision. Approximately 15,000 women taken captive. The military report uses a single word to describe what happened next: distribution, clean, administrative, bloodless. Until you read the personal letters that survived in the ruins of frontier forts. Until you see what Roman soldiers actually meant when they wrote that word in their journals. Until you understand that distribution was not about assigning labor, it was about organizing humiliation on an industrial scale. When a city fell to the legions, chaos did not erupt. Chaos would have been merciful in its randomness. Instead, there was sequence, procedure, the kind of cold efficiency that only comes from repetition and institutional approval. First, the sorting began in the city's central square. Men of fighting age were separated, some executed immediately as examples, others reserved for the arena where their deaths could be monetized as entertainment. The elderly and the very young were deemed logistically inconvenient, left to whatever fate awaited the economically useless in a war zone. And then came the women. They were gathered together, stripped not for practical reasons but for inspection, and left standing exposed under the Mediterranean sun for hours while Roman officers conducted what the military documents euphemistically called selection. The most physically desirable were marked a stroke of red dye painted across the left shoulder and set aside for commanders and senior centurions. The remainder were allocated to rank-and-file soldiers. There was even formal Latin terminology for this: praeda bella feminarum, female war spoils. The phrase appears in official correspondence and logistics planning, in tax assessments because, yes, the Roman state levied taxes on this particular category of plunder. A fragment of a letter discovered in the ash-preserved ruins of Pompeii, written by a legionary named Marcus Flavius Tertius during the Germanic campaigns, describes the aftermath with disturbing casualness. I claimed 3 for myself the first night. The youngest would not stop weeping. The second tried to bite my hand. The third simply stared at nothing, as though she had already departed her own body. I preferred the third. She required less effort. That word effort echoes across 2 millennia because it reveals the nature of the violence. This was not passion, not even hatred. It was the systematic erasure of personhood before the formal process of enslavement even began. Roman generals understood exactly what they were orchestrating. This ritual served a purpose far beyond allowing soldiers to release tension after long campaigns, as some modern historians delicately phrase it. It was a demonstration of absolute power, a message delivered with brutal clarity to any population that might consider resistance. This is what happens to your daughters, to your sisters, to every woman you have ever loved or protected. The message worked. The historian Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century, recorded the revolt of Boudica in Britain in 60 A.D. He notes that Boudica herself, along with her daughters, both of royal blood, were publicly violated by Roman officers after their initial capture, not as personal revenge, not as battlefield frenzy, as calculated political theater designed to break the spirit of the Iceni tribe. Boudica was a warrior queen who had led armies against Rome. Her daughters were princesses, and yet in a single afternoon, Roman policy reduced them to instruments of instruction. When Boudica later rallied what remained of her forces for a final desperate assault, she was no longer fighting merely for territory or sovereignty. She was fighting for something older and more visceral, for dignity that could never be restored, for screams that had been forced into silence, for revenge that could never truly satisfy because what had been taken could never be returned. She was defeated again. And what became of the surviving women of her tribe after that final suppression was never fully documented. We know only this: Britannia did not rebel against Rome for another 3 centuries. Is prolonged silence always evidence of peace? Or is it sometimes the footprint of terror so complete that even the possibility of speech has been extracted? But the ritual of conquest was only the opening act. What followed was the transformation of human beings into inventory. The survivors, those who had not died from shock, injury, or the calculated brutality of those first nights, were branded. Literally. Hot iron pressed into flesh, burning symbols that identified the legion that had captured them and the specific campaign in which they were taken. Marks of ownership often burned into the face so their status could never be concealed, never be forgotten, never allow them a moment of imagining themselves as anything other than property. Then came the march. Chained together in groups of 10 or 20, they were forced to walk sometimes hundreds of kilometers toward coastal ports. There they waited in dark warehouses, the same stone buildings used to store grain and amphorae of olive oil, until enough ships became available. They waited as cargo waits. A commercial inventory preserved in Alexandria, dated to 115 A.D., records the mixed manifest of a merchant vessel with perfect clarity: 340 amphorae of wine, 120 barrels of wheat, 89 women from Judea, 14 Berber horses. Women listed between wine and horses. Same ledger, same accounting column, same logistical category. The sea crossing lasted weeks. They were kept below deck, chained in rows with barely enough space to sit upright, no room to lie flat, no light except what filtered through gaps in the planking above. Daily rations were calculated with precision, just enough to keep them alive, nothing more. Many died during these voyages. Disease, dehydration, or simply surrender, the body giving up when the mind could no longer manufacture reasons to continue. The bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony or record. A Roman treatise on estate management written by Columella in the 1st century includes an economic calculation that has survived. He estimated that an acceptable loss rate during the transport of female war captives ranged between 20 and 30%. Acceptable, as though discussing spoiled fruit. When the ships finally reached Rome or Ostia or any of the empire's major ports, the next phase began. The auctions, specialized slave markets where human beings stood on raised platforms, while wealthy buyers inspected them, as one would inspect livestock, hands probing flesh, mouths forced open so teeth could be examined, signs of illness, injury, or pregnancy carefully noted because each affected market value. The youngest, those whose appearances had not yet been destroyed by the journey, commanded extraordinary prices. They were purchased by elite households, by luxury brothels that catered to senators and equestrians, by temples that offered certain specialized services to devotees of imported Eastern cults. The rest, the women whose bodies bore too many visible scars, whose spirits had visibly broken, whose appearances had deteriorated during weeks below deck, were sold in bulk, to mines, to farms, to workshops. In those places life expectancy rarely exceeded 5 years. But there was a fate that survivors of the auctions spoke of in whispers as worse than the mines, the brothels. Not the luxury establishments that served the elite, but the common lupanari of off dens that operated openly in every Roman city. Legal, regulated, taxed, the Roman state profited from every transaction. Female prisoners of war were the most sought-after commodity in these establishments. Why? Because they were foreign, because they came from defeated peoples, because for an ordinary Roman citizen, a man who had never worn armor or carried a gladius, purchasing access to the daughter of an enemy offered a sense of participation in imperial conquest. Victory by proxy. A piece of graffiti scratched into the wall of a brothel in Pompeii read simply, Hic ego puellum Britanniam futui, Rama eterna. Here I penetrated a British girl, Rome eternal. Even the most intimate act was transformed into a political declaration. The women in these places had no names. They were identified only by origin. The Gaul, the German, the Jew. They worked in stone cubicles smaller than 2 square meters, no windows, a single threadbare curtain serving as a door. They serviced between 10 and 20 men per day, every day, year after year. There was no retirement, no manumission after loyal service, as might happen to a household slave. No exit. Many turned to suicide. Others descended into complete psychological collapse. A very small number survived long enough to be freed by an unusually compassionate owner, or by scraping together enough coins over decades to purchase their own manumission. But even freedom could not erase what had been done. The brand on the face remained. The fractures inside remained. In the 2nd century, a Greek physician named Cyrannus of Ephesus wrote a medical treatise that included a chapter on gynecological conditions common among women, used in large volume. Prostitution. He described chronic inflammation, premature infertility, recurring internal hemorrhaging. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, a piece of business advice. Brothel proprietors are counseled to refresh their stock every 3 to 4 years, as after this period the merchandise loses commercial viability and productive capacity. Refresh the stock, as one might replace cracked amphorae. And all of this entire industrial apparatus of dehumanization functioned in broad daylight. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was denied. There was no collective shame, no moral discomfort, no questioning voices preserved in the literature of the time suggesting that perhaps this was wrong. It was simply considered the natural order, the logical outcome of military superiority. Rome won, the defeated paid, with everything they were and everything they might have become. But here is what makes this history even more suffocating. There are almost no first-person accounts. The victims themselves left no written testimony. They did not speak Latin or Greek fluently enough to write. They had no access to papyrus or stylus. And even if they had, who would have preserved their words? Who would have considered them worth recording? Yet there are rare, fragmentary exceptions that survived by accident. Blandina was a slave, originally captured during a campaign in Gaul, who later converted to Christianity while serving in a household in Lugdun, modern-day Lyon. When her faith was discovered and she was arrested during the persecutions under Marcus Aurelius, she spoke during interrogation about her past. A fragment of the account, preserved by early church chroniclers, records her words with startling clarity. They asked if I feared death. I told them I had already died many times. They killed me the night my village burned. They killed me on the march to the sea. They killed me in the ship's hold. They killed me the first time a Roman man called me property. Death before the lines would only confirm what is already true. Blandina was executed in the arena, but her words endured, and they reveal something essential. The trauma was not only physical, it was existential. The destruction was not merely of the body, but of the very possibility of recognizing oneself as fully human. These women were forced to learn a terrible lesson, that dignity, identity, and human worth are not inherent. They are conventions, revocable in an instant when sufficient force appears to revoke them. Another document from the 2nd century describes a rebellion of enslaved women on a rural estate in Hispania. They killed the landowner and his family during the night. When they were captured and brought before a Roman magistrate, the leader, a Germanic woman identified in the court records only as the red-haired one, spoke once before her execution. "You taught us that the world belongs to the violent." She said, "We only practiced the lesson." She was crucified alongside 17 others. But her sentence endured because it exposed the foundational hypocrisy. Rome presented itself as civilization, as law, order, and rationality imposed upon a barbaric world. But that civilization was constructed on systematic violence, on the calculated exploitation of the bodies and inner lives of the defeated. And when the defeated turned that same logic back upon their captors, suddenly they were not participants in the natural order. They were criminals. Centuries later, the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the chaotic final decades of the Western Empire, recorded something quietly devastating. During the invasions of the Huns and other groups that would eventually fracture Rome itself, he noted that some Roman women taken captive appeared strangely resigned to their fate, not hysterical, not defiant, resigned as though they recognized in what was happening to them a distant echo of something their own civilization had inflicted on others for generations, history folding inward. Rome harvesting what it had sown across 6 centuries of conquest. But recognition redeemed no one. It did not spare those Roman women. It did not lessen the horror. It merely revealed that human beings possess an almost limitless capacity to systematize cruelty, to turn the suffering of others into routine, into tradition, into something that feels normal. And when one system collapses, another is already waiting beneath it, wearing different clothes but speaking the same language. There is a tombstone in the British Museum, discovered near the ruins of a Roman fort in what was once Britannia. The inscription is brief, worn almost smooth by time. Here once was a woman, her name forgotten, her homeland forgotten. May the gods show her more mercy than Rome did. No name, no story, only an anonymous acknowledgment of suffering too immense to describe. How many others were there across 6 centuries of imperial expansion? Millions, each one a complete human life. A girl with a name, with parents, with hopes. A woman who loved and was loved. A full person reduced to an entry in a logistics report, a line in a commercial manifest, a footnote in history books most people never open. This was not the failure of Roman civilization. It was civilization functioning exactly as designed. The machine operated smoothly. Soldiers followed orders. Merchants conducted business. Citizens frequented licensed establishments and paid their taxes. Everything was legal. Everything was justified. Everything was considered inevitable. The poet once wrote that the people of the past were no worse than us. They simply did not yet know what we would later discover. But did they truly not know? Or did they know perfectly well and simply choose not to care? The records existed. The documents survived. Anyone who wanted to know could know. The issue was never ignorance. It was complicity. And when we today celebrate Rome's grandeur, its aqueducts, its roads, its laws without acknowledging what paid for them, when we teach children about the glory of the legions without explaining what followed victory, when we watch films about noble gladiators and visionary emperors, while conveniently forgetting the lupinaria that stood beside the Colosseum, do we not continue the same silence that began 2,000 years ago? The truth is uncomfortable. We prefer myths that allow us to admire the past without confronting its cost. We prefer to believe that those times were different, that we have evolved, that we would never do the same. But we do, in different forms, under different names, in places we choose not to look. The machinery changes hands. The essential logic remains. Somewhere beneath the ruins, the weeping of millions of women whose names were never carved into stone still lingers in the dust. They built Rome as much as any engineer or general did. They built it with their bodies, with their silenced voices, with everything they were and everything they might have become. And the question that haunts us is not whether such horrors remain in the past. It is whether we have truly moved beyond them or merely learned to hide them better, to justify them with more sophisticated language, to embed them in systems so complex that we no longer have to look directly at what we permit. The woman kneeling in the forum finally lifted her eyes, not toward the auctioneer, not toward the crowd, toward the sky, searching perhaps for gods who might still remember mercy, or simply for a horizon she would never see again.